The message arrived at 3:47 hours shipboard time, carried on a frequency that hadn't been used in over 200 years. It came through a relay buoy that had been drifting in the empty space between spiral arms, a dead artifact from a dead era, and it should not have been capable of transmitting anything at all. But it did. A single compressed packet, encrypted with a cipher key that hadn't been issued since the signing of the Terran Accords, bounced off 17 dormant satellite networks before finally arriving at its destination. The bridge of the TSV outward bound, currently cruising through a stretch of uninhabited space that cartographers called the Veil. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was the only person on the bridge when the message arrived. She was drinking terrible coffee and reviewing stellar cartography updates that would never matter to anyone, because the Outward Bound was on a survey mission to a system that 3 previous surveys had already confirmed was empty. It was the kind of assignment that ended careers. She had been starring at the same starfield for 6 weeks, and she had stopped finding it beautiful around week 2. The console chirped, not the standard communications chirp. The Outward Bound hadn't received an external communication in 19 days, but a different sound. A sound she had only ever heard during training simulations. A Priority Alpha authentication request. She set down her coffee. Her finger hovered over the accept key for 3 full seconds before she pressed it. The decryption took 11 seconds. It felt like 11 hours. When the text appeared on her screen, she read it once. Then she read it again. Then she stood up from her chair so quickly that she knocked her coffee mug onto the deck, where it shattered and sent dark liquid pooling across the deck plates, and she didn't notice. She was already running for the captain's quarters. Captain Marcus Webb had been asleep for less than 2 hours. He'd spent the previous 16 hours dealing with a malfunctioning plasma conduit in the engineering section that had required him to personally crawl through a maintenance shaft, because his chief engineer was recovering from a minor surgical procedure, and the backup engineer had somehow managed to lock himself in a supply closet. Webb was 53 years old, had served in the Terran Spatial Navy for 29 years, and had commanded the Outward Bound for the last 4. He had gray hair, a bad knee, and a persistent cough that the ship's medical officer kept telling him to get checked out, but that he kept ignoring because he didn't want to be pulled off active duty for something that was probably nothing. When Chen pounded on his door, he assumed the plasma conduit had failed again. He pulled on a jacket, opened the door, and found his executive officer standing in the corridor with a face so pale she looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Captain, you need to see this." She handed him a data tablet. He looked at the screen. He read the message. He read it again the way Chen had. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time in all the years she'd served under him, she saw something in Marcus Webb's eyes that she couldn't name. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something older, something from deeper in the evolutionary stack. "Get me a secure channel to Sol Command," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled. "Priority 1 diplomatic encryption, and wake the crew, all of them." "All of them, sir. All of them." The message was short. That was what made it so devastating. In the vast bureaucracy of interstellar communication, where diplomatic missives routinely ran to hundreds of pages of addenda, clarifications, and conditional clauses, brevity was not a stylistic choice. It was a weapon. The message read, "To Terran Spatial Navy, all active vessels. From Galactic Council Observer Corps, Department of XENOLOGICL AFFAIRS. ARI, Council Resolution 7749 Omega. Classification Eyes Only Commanding OFFICRS. Be it known that on this date, the Galactic Council, in closed session, BY vote of 11 member species 20, with 4 ABSDNTIONS and 1 recorded objection from the Terran delegation, has passed Resolution 7749 Omega, the full text of which is APPENDED below. Be it further known that the Terran delegation was DENIED access to the VOTING chamber for the duration of DELIBRATONS pursuant to Article 347 of the Council Charter, and that the Terran objection was entered into the record post-vote, and CARRIS no legal weight under Council precedent. The essence of Resolution 7749 Omega is as FOLLOWS. The Galactic Council hereby DCLARES the Terran species, Homo sapins, and all associated Terran colonial populations to be a Class 3 existential hazard to the galactic community. Pursuant to PROVSIONS, established under the KRSH Accords of Standard Year 11247, the Council authorizes the immediate imposition of a complete quarantine perimeter around all Terran-controlled space, to be enforced by Joint Council Naval FORCES. All Terran vessels found beyond the quarantine perimeter are hereby subject to seizure or destruction at the discretion of enforcement commanders. All non-Terran vessels are prohibited from entering Terran-controlled space under penalty of Council sanction. This quarantine is declared indefinite and may only be lifted by unanimous Council vote. Further PROVISIONS of Resolution 7749 Omega pertain to resource allocation, force deployment TIMLINES, and species-specific operational assignments. Full text APPNDD. This message has been transmitted via redundant channels to all known Terran naval INSTLLATONS and active vessels. No response is required or expected. This message CONSTITUTES official notification under Council law. Ignorance of this notification does not constitute a defense under Council jurisprudence. End the transmission. By the time the message had finished propagating through the relay network, a process that took approximately 4 hours due to the distances involved and the degraded state of the ancient relay buoys, every human being in a position of authority within the Terran Spatial Navy had read it. So had every planetary governor, every colonial administrator, every intelligence officer above the rank of lieutenant, and, inevitably, approximately 40,000 civilian communications technicians who had intercepted the transmission while it was in transit. Secrecy in the age of interstellar communication was a polite fiction. Within 12 hours of the first transmission, the message was everywhere. Every news service, every social network, every public forum in human space was saturated with analysis, commentary, and raw, unfiltered panic. The reaction on Earth was immediate and predictable. Stock markets crashed. Governments issued contradictory statements. Religious leaders declared everything from divine judgment to divine protection. Protesters filled the streets of every major city, some demanding war, others demanding surrender, still others demanding that someone, anyone, explain what was happening. The reaction in the colonies was different. Colonists were, by self-selection and by necessity, a different breed. They had left Earth behind, some of them generations ago, to build lives on worlds that were actively trying to kill them. They didn't panic, they got angry. On New Gibraltar, the largest human colony outside the Sol system, a crowd of 10,000 gathered outside the Colonial Administration building and stood in absolute silence for 3 hours. Then they went home and began checking their weapon systems. On Cascade, a farming colony with a population of less than 50,000, the colonial militia activated every member within 6 hours of receiving the message and began fortifying the only approach corridor to the system. On the research station at Prometheus Point, a team of xenolinguists who had spent the last decade studying Galactic Council diplomatic protocols published a 40-page analysis that concluded, with careful academic precision, that Resolution 7749 Omega was not actually a declaration of war. It was, they argued, a quarantine measure with teeth, a distinction that mattered enormously in Council law, but that would mean absolutely nothing if a Council enforcement fleet started shooting at human ships. Someone, it was never determined who, spray-painted a message on the wall of the Sol Command headquarters on Luna that summed up the situation more concisely than any official statement ever could. 1120. They didn't even have the courage to make it close. Admiral David Kowalski had been expecting something like this for years. Not this specifically, not the exact wording, not the legalistic precision, not the particular number of votes, but the general shape of it. He had served as humanity's military liaison to the Galactic Council for 6 years, and in that time he had watched the political weather shift with the slow, grinding inevitability of a tectonic plate. Kowalski was 61 years old, built like a retired heavyweight boxer, with a shaved head and a reputation for saying exactly what he thought in a diplomatic culture built on saying exactly nothing. The Council had requested his replacement 3 times. Earth had ignored those requests 3 times. The result had been a 6-year diplomatic starring contest that had resolved nothing and pleased no one. He was in his office on Luna when the message arrived. He read it once, set down the tablet, and opened a secure channel to the Joint Chiefs. "I told you this was coming," he said before anyone else had spoken. "We know, David," said General Aisha Okonkwo, the chair of the Joint Chiefs. Her voice was calm, the way it always was. She had commanded ground forces during the trench war on New Gibraltar 15 years ago, when a local parasite species had adapted to human neurochemistry and started turning colonists into something that was no longer entirely human. Okonkwo had personally led the counteroffensive that had driven the parasites back to their subterranean nests and sealed them in with controlled demolitions. She did not panic. "The question is what we do now." "We comply with nothing," Kowalski said. "We acknowledge nothing. We do not confirm receipt. Under Council law, a quarantine resolution requires acknowledged receipt by the affected party to take full legal effect. If we don't acknowledge it, we create a legal gray area that our diplomats can exploit for years. We don't have diplomats anymore, David. The council expelled our delegation 2 hours after the vote. Then we get new ones or we don't. The point is we don't play their game. What game are we playing? Kowalski leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, Earth hung in the void, blue and white and impossibly fragile-looking. He had spent his entire career defending that pale dot, and he was not about to stop now. We play ours, he said. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to understand what had come before. Not the grand sweep of human history, that story has been told 1,000 times, but the specific, peculiar relationship between humanity and the Galactic Council, because without that context, Resolution 7749 Omega makes no sense at all. Humans had discovered faster-than-light travel in the year 2089, using a propulsion system based on principles that the physicists of the time didn't fully understand, and that the physicists of the current era understood only marginally better. The Alcubierre Tanaka drive, as it was called, worked by compressing spacetime in front of a vessel and expanding it behind, creating a bubble of flat space that could move at effectively infinite speed relative to the outside universe. It was, by any reasonable metric, impossible. It worked anyway. The first human FTL transit covered a distance of 4.3 light-years and took approximately 11 seconds. The vessel, the Prometheus, arrived in the Alpha Centauri system, surveyed 3 planets, found nothing alive more complex than a lichen analog, and returned to Earth. The crew was celebrated as heroes, the drive was refined, more ships were built, humanity began to spread. They found the Council in 2147. The Venture, a long-range survey vessel under the command of Captain Yuki Tanaka, no relation to the drive's co-inventor, detected an artificial signal emanating from a star system approximately 40 light-years from Earth. Investigation revealed a vast orbital structure surrounding a gas giant, clearly constructed by an intelligent species, clearly ancient, and clearly still inhabited. The Venture was detected in turn, and within hours, Captain Tanaka found herself in communication with representatives of a species called the Veldrani, who spoke perfect English, which they had learned by intercepting and decoding Earth's broadcast signals, and who had a message for humanity that was, in retrospect, both welcoming and ominous. Welcome to the neighborhood, there are rules, we'll explain them. The Veldrani were one of 11 member species of the Galactic Council, an institution that had existed in various forms for approximately 12,000 standard years. The Council's purpose, as described to human diplomats over the following decades, was simple: to prevent wars between species. Its methods were complex, a vast web of treaties, protocols, precedents, and procedural mechanisms that governed everything from territorial disputes to trade agreements to the acceptable parameters of first contact scenarios. Humans were invited to join as an observer species in 2163. Full membership was granted in 2191, after a probationary period during which humanity demonstrated, somewhat reluctantly and with several notable violations, the ability to follow council rules. The problem was that humans were very, very good at breaking rules they didn't respect, and they didn't respect very many of the council's rules. The council had been built by species that were, by human standards, fundamentally conservative. The Veldrani thought in generational timescales. A project that took a century to complete was considered hastily executed. The Kathrenti, a reptilian species from a high-gravity world, valued stability above all else and had maintained the same political structures for over 8,000 years. The Phalini, arboreal creatures with a deeply ingrained instinct for hierarchy, found human social mobility baffling and slightly offensive. The Sulemi, who communicated through bioluminescent patterns and possessed no concept of deception in their native psychology, were genuinely disturbed by the human capacity for lying. Humans, by contrast, were fast. They adapted quickly. They innovated constantly. They took risks that other species considered insane. They changed their minds, their plans, their entire social structures in spans of time that the Veldrani considered the blink of an eye. They were, in the terminology of council xenosociologists, hyperdynamic, a polite way of saying they were unpredictable, unstable, and deeply uncomfortable to be around. For 200 years, this tension had been manageable. Humans were useful. Their technology progressed at a rate that no other species could match, not because humans were smarter, but because they were willing to try things that other species wouldn't. The Alcubierre Tanaka drive was a perfect example. No Veldrani physicist would have proposed it, because Veldrani physics didn't allow for the kind of conceptual leaps that made it possible. The Veldrani approach to FTL travel had taken 400 years of careful, methodical research. Humans had stumbled onto theirs in a decade and a half. This usefulness had bought humanity a great deal of tolerance. Council member species benefited from human technology, human medical advances, human engineering solutions. In return, humans were granted access to Council trade networks, Council navigational data, and Council protection under the mutual defense provisions of the Kresh Accords. But tolerance had its limits, and those limits had been approaching for a long time. The first major fracture had occurred 80 years ago when human colonists in the Vale Reach, a stretch of space claimed by the K-Threnti but not actively occupied, had established a settlement on a planet the K-Threnti considered sacred. The K-Threnti demanded the colony's removal. The colonists refused. The council mediated and a compromise was reached that satisfied no one. The colony stayed. The K-Threnti seethed. The second fracture had occurred 50 years ago, when human scientists had developed a weapon system based on directed energy that violated the specific wording, if not the spirit of the Kresh Accords' prohibition on indiscriminate area-effect weapons of mass destruction. The Council had ordered the weapon decommissioned. Humanity had complied slowly and incompletely. The third fracture had occurred 20 years ago, when human intelligence services had been caught running a covert operation inside Veldrani space, gathering information on Veldrani military capabilities. The Veldrani had been furious. Humans had apologized. The apology had not been believed. These fractures and dozens of smaller ones had accumulated over 2 centuries like stress on a fault line. Resolution 7749 Omega was the earthquake. But it was not Kowalski knew the whole story. There was something else. Something that the message didn't mention, that the Council would never admit publicly, and that Kowalski had only learned about through a source so sensitive that he had never told anyone about it. Not the Joint Chiefs, not the civilian leadership, not even his wife. 3 years ago, a Veldrani defector had contacted human intelligence through a chain of intermediaries so convoluted that it had taken 6 months just to verify that the defector was real. The defector's name, translated into English, was approximately one who sees the edge of things. He had been a senior member of the Veldrani's diplomatic service and had sat in on closed council sessions for over a century. What he had told human intelligence was this: the council was afraid. Not of human weapons, not of human military power. Humanity's military was, by council standards, modest. The Veldrani alone could field a fleet that outmassed the entire Terran spatial navy by a factor of 10. The K-Threnti could do the same. Combined council forces could overrun human space in a matter of months, assuming they were willing to accept the casualties. What the council feared was human potential. Every other species in the council had plateaued. Their technologies advanced but incrementally. Their populations grew but slowly. Their cultures evolved but within established parameters. They had reached a kind of equilibrium, a stable state that they had maintained for thousands of years. Humans had not plateaued. Every metric of human capability, technological, economic, demographic, cognitive, was still accelerating. The Alcubierre Tanaka drive was 200 years old, and human physicists were already theorizing about its successor, a propulsion system that would make the current drive look like a rowboat. Human artificial intelligence had progressed in 2 centuries to a point that Veldrani AI researchers had predicted would take 3,000 years. Human medicine had achieved things that the Sulemi, the Council's acknowledged masters of biological science, considered impossible. The defector had used a Veldrani phrase that didn't translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation was, "They are not afraid of what you are, they are afraid of what you will become." And that fear had been growing quietly in the closed chambers of the Council, fed by every new human achievement, every human provocation, every reminder that the youngest species in the galactic community was also the most dangerous. Resolution 7749 Omega was not a declaration of war. Kowalski was certain of that. It was something worse. It was an admission of fear, formalized in legal language and ratified by unanimous vote. It was 11 ancient, powerful civilizations looking at humanity and saying, in effect, "We cannot compete with you, and we cannot control you, so we will contain you." The question was whether containment would hold. And the answer to that question depended on factors that no one, not the Council, not human leadership, not anyone, could fully predict. The first Council enforcement fleet appeared on the edge of human space 14 days after the quarantine was declared. It consisted of 47 vessels, Veldrani, K-Threnti, and Felini, flying under a joint command structure that had been established specifically for this operation. The fleet took up positions along the quarantine line, a notional boundary that ran along the outer edge of human-controlled space, and began broadcasting identification requests to any vessel that approached. The outward bound was approximately 3 light-years inside the quarantine line when the fleet arrived. Captain Webb had already reversed course and was heading for the nearest human system at maximum speed. There was nothing else to do. Surveying empty star systems was no longer a priority. But other human vessels were not so lucky. At the time of the quarantine declaration, there were 32 human ships outside the line, freighters, survey vessels, a few naval patrol craft, and one luxury cruise liner carrying 900 passengers on a tour of the Outer Veil. All of them were now, under council law, subject to seizure or destruction. The freighters and survey vessels received the identification requests, declined to respond, and ran for the quarantine line at maximum speed. Most of them made it. The Council Enforcement Fleet, operating under rules of engagement that had not yet been tested, chose not to fire on fleeing civilian vessels. This was, Kowalski noted with grim satisfaction, a sign of weakness. If the Council was serious about enforcing the quarantine, they would have shot. The fact that they didn't meant they were still hopping for a negotiated solution. The naval patrol craft responded differently. 3 patrol ships, each crewed by 12, received the identification requests and responded with a single message: Terran Spatial Navy Vessel. You are in violation of the Terran Accords, Section 7, Paragraph 3, which guarantees freedom of navigation for all signatory species in all non-restricted space. This space is not restricted. Withdraw or be fired upon. The Council fleet did not withdraw. The patrol craft did not fire. A 12-hour standoff ensued, during which both sides broadcast their legal positions at each other and neither side budged. Eventually, the patrol craft were ordered to withdraw by Sol Command, which was not yet ready to escalate to a shooting war. The patrol craft withdrew sullenly and crossed the quarantine line under the guns of Council warships. The cruise liner was the problem. The Star of Sol, a converted passenger vessel operated by a private company called Celestial Cruises, had been on day 43 of a 60-day tour when the quarantine was declared. It was slow, civilian-grade engines, no military specification, and it was 120 light-years outside the quarantine line when the enforcement fleet arrived. There was no way it could outrun a Council warship. Its captain, a retired Navy officer named Patricia Reyes, knew this. She also knew that the 900 people on her ship, families, retirees, children, were not equipped to handle a boarding action by hostile alien forces. Reyes broadcast a message on all frequencies. This is the Star of Sol Terran Registry civilian vessel. We have 900 souls aboard, including 300 miners. We are unarmed. We are requesting safe passage to the quarantine line. If you intend to board this vessel, we will resist with whatever means are available to us. I want that on your conscience. The Council fleet responded with a message that was, by Council standards, almost compassionate. Civilian vessel Star of Sol, you are directed to reduce speed and prepare for boarding. Your passengers will be treated in accordance with Council protocols for displaced civilians. Resistance will be met with appropriate force. Reyes did not reduce speed. She also did not resist because there was nothing to resist with. The Star of Sol had no weapons, no military-grade shielding, and a crew that consisted mostly of hospitality workers. She continued toward the quarantine line at her maximum speed, which was approximately 1/3 the speed of a Council warship. A Veldrani cruiser matched course with the Star of Sol and spent 11 hours sailing alongside it, broadcasting the same boarding directive every 15 minutes. The cruiser did not fire. It did not attempt to disable the liner's engines. It simply followed. On the bridge of the Star of Sol, Captain Reyes watched the Veldrani vessel on her display screen and felt a complex mixture of terror and contempt. They were going to let her reach the line. She could see it in the cruiser's behavior, the way it maintained a precise distance, the way its weapons remained powered down, the way it didn't attempt to close the gap. The Veldrani didn't want a massacre on their hands. They didn't want 900 dead humans, including children, broadcast across every communication network in the galaxy. They were posturing, and they were doing it badly. The Star of Sol crossed the quarantine line 47 hours after the enforcement fleet arrived. The Veldrani cruiser broke off and returned to its station. Captain Reyes did not celebrate. She knew that the next time the calculus might be different. On Earth, the political response to the quarantine was chaos. The United Terran Parliament, humanity's overarching governmental body, created in the aftermath of First Contact to present a unified face to the galactic community, was supposed to be the body that formulated and executed humanity's response to Resolution 7749 Omega. Instead, it spent the first 3 weeks after the quarantine declaration arguing about whether to acknowledge the resolution, condemn the resolution, ignore the resolution, or demand that the Council provide a full explanation of the legal reasoning behind the resolution. The Parliament's inability to act was not entirely its fault. The body was, by design, a consensus mechanism. It represented the interests of Earth's 147 member states, each of which had its own priorities, its own constituencies, and its own opinion about what should be done. Some states wanted immediate military mobilization. Others wanted diplomatic overtures. Still others wanted to focus on internal security, fearing that the quarantine would cause economic collapse and civil unrest. Reaching a consensus among 147 disagreeing parties took time, and time was a luxury that humanity did not have. The person who ultimately broke the deadlock was not a politician, she was an engineer. Dr. Lena Vasquez was 57 years old and the director of the Prometheus Advanced Research Institute, a facility located on the far side of the moon that was, in the carefully vague language of its charter, dedicated to the exploration of theoretical physics and its practical applications. In practice, this meant that PARI was where humanity's most dangerous and most advanced technologies were developed, away from prying eyes both alien and domestic. Vasquez had not been following the political crisis closely. She had been busy with a problem that had consumed her attention for the past 5 years, the development of a new FTL drive that would render the Alcubierre-Tanaka drive obsolete. She called it the Vasquez drive, although she privately thought of it as the thing that shouldn't work but does, which was also how she thought of the Alcubierre-Tanaka drive. The Vasquez drive did not compress spacetime. It did something else, something that Vasquez's own theoretical framework described as phase-shifting the vessel into a state of quantum non-locality with respect to the target coordinate. What this meant in practice was that a ship equipped with a Vasquez drive could move from any point in the galaxy to any other point in the galaxy instantaneously. No travel time, no transit corridor, no detectable wavefront. One moment the ship was here, the next moment it was there. The drive had been tested twice. Both tests had been successful. Both tests had been classified at the highest level of secrecy, known only to Vasquez, her immediate team of 12 researchers, and a single civilian oversight committee that had been selected for the specific purpose of not telling anyone what they knew. The existence of the Vasquez drive changed everything. If the Council's quarantine was based on the assumption that human ships could be intercepted at the quarantine line, a reasonable assumption, given that the Alcubierre-Tanaka drive created a detectable spacetime distortion that could be tracked by any species with sufficiently advanced sensors, then the Vasquez drive made the quarantine irrelevant. A ship equipped with a Vasquez drive could appear anywhere in Council space without warning. It could appear in orbit around the Veldrani homeworld. It could appear inside a Council naval formation. It could appear anywhere. Vasquez had not told the Parliament about the drive because she didn't trust the Parliament. She had not told the military because she didn't trust the military. She had told the Oversight Committee because she was legally required to, and she had trusted the committee because it was composed of 3 people whom she had personally selected for their ability to keep secrets. But now, with the quarantine in place and the political situation deteriorating by the hour, Vasquez made a decision. She called Admiral Kowalski. She didn't go through channels. She didn't submit a request through the proper bureaucratic procedures. She called him on a personal communication line that she had obtained through means that were technically illegal, and she said, "Admiral, I have something you need to see. Can you come to PARI tonight?" Kowalski came. He saw the test data. He watched the recordings of the 2 test flights, the first a short hop to the asteroid belt, the second a jump to a point 200 light-years away and back. He sat in silence for a long time after the second recording ended. "How long to scale this up?" he asked. "The drive itself is scalable. The engineering challenges are significant but solvable. With sufficient resources, I could have a full-scale prototype installed on a naval vessel within 18 months. With unlimited resources, maybe 12. We don't have 18 months, we may not have 12. Then give me what you can, and I'll give you what I can." Kowalski left PARI at 200 hours. By 300, he had placed a call to General Okonkwo that would, in retrospect, be recognized as the moment humanity stopped playing defense. What happened over the next 6 months was the most rapid military and technological mobilization in human history. PARI was expanded from a research facility with a staff of 300 to an industrial complex with a staff of 14,000. Construction crews worked around the clock, building fabrication facilities, testing bays, and living quarters. The Vasquez drive was reverse-engineered, optimized, and adapted for mass production by a team of engineers who had been told only that they were working on a propulsion project of critical national importance. Security was so tight that the 14,000 workers were divided into compartmentalized teams, each responsible for a specific component of the drive, with no team having access to the complete design. While the drive was being developed, the Terran Spatial Navy was undergoing its own transformation. Every active vessel was recalled to human space. Every reserve ship was activated. Every shipyard in human-controlled space was placed on emergency production status, building new vessels at a rate that would have been considered impossible under normal circumstances. The Navy had been designed for patrol and defense, a constabulary force, not a war fleet. It was being transformed into something else. The Council watched this transformation with growing alarm. Their sensors could detect the construction activity, the movement of ships, the increased energy signatures from human industrial facilities. They could not, however, detect the Vasquez drive research, because the Vasquez drive did not produce the kind of detectable signatures that Council sensors were designed to look for. The Council knew that humanity was building ships. They did not know that those ships would be equipped with a technology that made every strategic assumption underlying the quarantine obsolete. This asymmetry of information was, Kowalski believed, the single greatest advantage humanity had ever possessed. The Council was making decisions based on incomplete data, and the data they lacked was the most important data of all. He intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. The first test of the quarantine's fragility came 5 months after its imposition, and it came not from the military but from a civilian. A woman named Jinsu Park, a cargo pilot operating out of New Gibraltar, had been watching the quarantine with simmering anger for 5 months. Her business, hauling agricultural equipment between colony worlds, had been devastated by the restrictions. She had lost her ship, her savings, and her home. She was living in a transit dormitory on New Gibraltar, working menial jobs to feed her 2 children, and she was furious. Park was not a military person. She was not a political person. She was a pilot, someone who had spent her entire adult life moving through space and who felt the quarantine as a personal violation. Space was her home. The quarantine had locked her out of it. She did something that was, by any reasonable standard, incredibly stupid. She stole a ship. The ship was an older model freighter, decommissioned and scheduled for scrapping, that had been sitting in a New Gibraltar orbital yard for 3 months. Its systems were degraded, its engines were unreliable, and its Alcubierre Tanaka drive was operating at approximately 60% efficiency. It should not have been flyable. Park made it flyable, using a combination of ingenuity, scavenged parts, and a sheer stubbornness that would later become the subject of songs and legends. She launched the ship without authorization, without filing a flight plan, and without telling anyone where she was going. She pointed the ship at the quarantine line and accelerated. The Council enforcement fleet detected her almost immediately. A K-30 patrol vessel intercepted her 20 minutes before she reached the line and broadcast a standard identification and diversion request. Park did not respond. The K-30 vessel fired a warning shot across her bow. Park did not divert. The K-30 vessel fired a second warning shot closer this time. Park did not divert. The K-30 commander, operating under rules of engagement that authorized the use of disabling fire against non-compliant vessels, ordered his weapons officer to target the freighter's engines. The shot was fired. It hit the freighter's engine housing, causing significant damage. The freighter's speed dropped by half. It was still moving toward the line. A second K-30 vessel joined the pursuit. Together, the 2 warships bracketed the freighter and began a coordinated effort to disable it without destroying it. This was more difficult than it sounded. Human-built ships were notoriously rugged, and the freighter's age systems had a kind of degraded resilience that newer systems lacked. It took 4 additional hits to bring the freighter to a complete stop, and by that time, it had crossed the quarantine line by approximately 300,000 kilometers. Park was detained, her ship was seized. The K-30 transferred her to a Council holding facility, where she was held without charge for 6 weeks before being quietly released and returned to human space. The incident was, by military standards, minor. No one was killed, no significant strategic asset was compromised, but the political impact was enormous. The image of a single civilian woman in a broken-down freighter defying the combined military might of the Galactic Council became a symbol. It was shared on every human communication network. It was discussed in every human forum. It was held up as proof that the quarantine was not about safety or security, it was about humiliation. It was about 11 powerful species telling humanity to stay in its place and 1 human refusing. Park herself, when asked later why she had done it, gave an answer that was so simple and so perfectly human that it became a rallying cry. Because they told me I couldn't. 7 months after the quarantine, the Council made its first diplomatic overture. It came in the form of a message transmitted through official channels, a marked departure from the clandestine method used to deliver Resolution 7749 Omega. The message was addressed to the United Terran Parliament and was signed by the Veldrani ambassador to the Council, who spoke for the entire body in matters of interspecies communication. The message was long, detailed, and in its way reasonable. It acknowledged the hardship that the quarantine had imposed on human populations. It expressed regret for the unfortunate necessity of the resolution. It offered to discuss modifications to the quarantine if humanity would agree to certain conditions. The conditions were, from a human perspective, insulting. Humanity was asked to limit its FTL drive research to parameters approved by the Council. Humanity was asked to submit all new technological developments to a council review board before deployment. Humanity was asked to accept a permanent council observer presence in all human systems. Humanity was asked to reduce its naval forces to a level deemed appropriate by council military assessors. In exchange, the council offered to lift the quarantine gradually over a period of 50 years, with regular reviews to assess humanity's compliance and integration. The parliament debated the offer for 2 weeks. The vote was 144 to 3 against acceptance. The 3 states that voted in favor were immediately subjected to votes of no confidence by their own populations and replaced within days. The council's response to the rejection was measured. No additional military forces were deployed. No new restrictions were imposed. But the tone of council communications shifted subtly from conciliatory to concerned, and Kowalski noticed something that no one else seemed to see. The council stopped talking about the quarantine as a temporary measure and started referring to it as a long-term stability protocol. They were settling in, they were planning to stay. 8 months after the quarantine, the Vasquez drive was ready. Not fully ready, Vasquez wanted another 6 months of testing, and her engineers wanted another year, but ready enough. A test installation had been completed on a decommissioned naval vessel, the TSV Experiment, and the drive had been successfully activated 11 times in controlled conditions, including 3 jumps of over 500 light-years. It worked. It worked every time. Kowalski stood in the PARI control room and watched the 11th test jump on a display screen. The experiment was sitting in a test bay on the far side of the moon. On the screen, it flickered, a quantum shimmer that the sensors could barely detect, and then it was gone. 30 seconds later, it reappeared. Its navigation computer reported that it had traveled to a point 512 light-years away and back. Any detection by external sensors? Kowalski asked. None, Vasquez said. We had a council surveillance satellite in lunar orbit during the jump. Its sensors detected nothing. As far as the council knows, that ship hasn't moved. Kowalski nodded slowly. How many ships can we equip? With current production capacity, 1 per month starting in approximately 60 days. If you can get me more resources, maybe 2 per month. And the council doesn't know this exists. The council doesn't know this exists. Kowalski looked at the screen. The experiment sat in its bay, looking like an ordinary naval vessel, unremarkable in every way. But it was the most dangerous ship in the galaxy because it could go anywhere and no one would know until it arrived. He made a decision. It was not a decision that he had the authority to make. It was not a decision that should have been made by one person. But the parliament was still arguing, the civilian leadership was still paralyzed, and the council was settling in for a long siege, and Kowalski had spent his entire career in the gap between what he was authorized to do and what needed to be done. Install the drive on a ship that's combat capable, he said. Not the experiment, a real warship. I want it ready in 30 days. Vasquez stared at him. A warship, with a drive that's been tested 11 times. 12 after today, 13 after tomorrow. 15 by the end of the week. Dr. Vasquez, I need a capability and I need it now, not in 6 months, not when you're comfortable, now. That's incredibly reckless. Yes, it is. Welcome to being human. The ship he chose was the TSV Defiance, a Swift-class attack vessel that had been pulled from the reserve fleet and refitted with upgraded weapons and shielding. It was fast, well-armed, and carried a crew of 40. Its captain was a woman named Priya Sharma, a 34-year-old officer who had been flagged by her superiors as someone with exceptional tactical intuition and an above-average tolerance for ambiguity, which was military speak for she's good at figuring out what to do when no one tells her what to do. Sharma was told only that her ship was being equipped with a new propulsion system and that she would receive her orders from Admiral Kowalski directly. She was not told what the propulsion system was. She was not told what her mission would be. She was told to have her crew ready for departure in 30 days and to ask no questions that she didn't need the answers to. She asked questions anyway. She was that kind of officer. But she asked them quietly and she didn't push when she didn't get answers, and on the 30th day, when the Defiance was sitting in a PARI test bay with a drive installed that her engineers told her was fundamentally different from anything we've ever seen, she took the ship out without knowing where she was going. Kowalski's orders arrived when the Defiance was 2 hours out from the moon, cruising at sublight speed in a direction that would take it away from any council surveillance assets. The orders were brief. Captain SHRMA, you are to proceed to the following coordinates using your new propulsion system. Upon arrival, you are to conduct a reconnaissance overflight of the target and return to human space. You are not to engage, you are not to communicate, you are not to be DETCTED. If you are DETCTED, you are to withdraw immediately. The success of this mission is critical to the security of the human species. Good luck. The coordinates were for a point in deep space, approximately 800 light-years from Earth, in a system that Sharma had never heard of. She looked it up in the ship's database. The system was listed as Veldrani, Restricted Naval Facility 7 Theta. She looked at the coordinates. She looked at her crew. She looked at the drive that her engineers had just finished calibrating and that they had described with professional understatement as probably going to work. Helm, she said, input those coordinates, everyone else strap in. The Defiance flickered and vanished. It reappeared 800 light-years away, in a system that contained a gas giant orbited by a vast orbital structure, shipyards, dry docks, weapons platforms, and a naval fleet that Sharma counted automatically as her sensors swept the area. 47 ships, Council warships mostly Veldrani with a scattering of K-30 vessels, the same class of ships that were enforcing the quarantine line. But here, in this hidden naval facility, they were not patrolling. They were building, repairing, preparing. Sharma's sensors recorded everything. Hull configurations, weapons arrays, engine signatures, crew complement estimates, defensive emplacements, communication traffic. The Defiance hung in the outer reaches of the system, powered down to minimum emissions, collecting data like a sponge. No one detected it. The Vasquez drive left no trace. There was no wavefront to detect, no radiation signature, no anomalous spacetime reading. The Defiance was, for all practical purposes, a ghost. Sharma spent 4 hours in the system, then she ordered the helm to take them home. The Defiance reappeared in human space 2 hours later. The intelligence it had gathered was transmitted to Sol Command within minutes of arrival. Kowalski received the data packet personally. He reviewed it with his intelligence staff for 6 hours. What they found confirmed his suspicions and then some. Facility 7 Theta was not a forward base. It was a staging area. The 47 ships there were part of a larger force, a much larger force. Communication intercepts decoded by AI systems that had been trained on Veldrani linguistic patterns reference Phase 2 of an operation designated Quiet Resolve. The specifics were fragmented, but the outlines were clear. The Council was preparing to escalate the quarantine from a passive blockade to an active containment operation. Phase 2 involved the deployment of additional forces, the establishment of forward operating bases inside the quarantine zone, and most disturbingly, the authorization of proactive interdiction, which meant that Council forces would no longer wait for human ships to approach the line. They would enter human space and find them. The timeline, as best as Kowalski's analysts could determine, was 3 to 4 months. Kowalski brought the intelligence to the Parliament. For the first time in the crisis, the body acted quickly. A state of emergency was declared. Full mobilization was authorized. The Vasquez Drive program was given unlimited resources and a new classification level that placed it above all other military priorities. And for the first time, humanity communicated directly with the Galactic Council. The message was short, not as short as the Council's quarantine notification, but short by human diplomatic standards, which tended toward verbosity. From United Terran Parliament. To Galactic Council. The United Terran Parliament ACKNOWLEDGES receipt of your recent diplomatic overture and rejects its terms in their entirety. The quarantine imposed by Resolution 7749 Omega is an illegal ACT under the Terran Accords, the KRESH Accords, and the General PRINCIPLES of INTRSPCIS law as recognized by this body. Humanity does not recognize the Council's authority to restrict the movement of human VESSELS in non-restricted space. Humanity does not recognize the Council's authority to dictate the technological development of any species. Humanity does not recognize the Council's authority to declare any species a Class 3 existential hazard based on a vote in which the affected species was DENIED participation. Furthermore, the United Terran Parliament is aware of Operation Quiet Resolve and the Council's plans to escalate the quarantine to active containment. We are aware of Facility 7 Theta and the Naval FORCES being staged there. We are aware of the timeline for Phase 2 implementation. This message serves as formal notice. Any attempt by Council forces to enter human-controlled space for the purpose of proactive interdiction will be met with the full capacity of the Terran Spatial Navy. We urge the Council to reconsider its position before irreversible CONSEQUENCES ensue. End the transmission. The Council's response took 48 hours. It was a single sentence. The Galactic Council notes your response and REGRETS your decision. The Council did not reconsider. Phase 2 proceeded on schedule. 4 months after the quarantine was declared, a council fleet of over 200 vessels crossed the quarantine line and entered human space. They moved in a coordinated formation, deploying to pre-planned positions and systems along the inner boundary of human-controlled territory. They did not fire. They did not attempt to board any vessels. They simply arrived and took up stations like police officers setting up checkpoints on a highway. Humanity's response was not what the Council expected. The Council had expected resistance, conventional resistance. Human ships would converge on the intrusion points, issue challenges, and attempt to force the Council vessels to withdraw. There might be skirmishes, there might be casualties, but the Council's numerical and technological superiority would prevail and the situation would settle into a new equilibrium. Human space effectively occupied, human movements restricted, human pride wounded but intact. That is not what happened. On the day the Council fleet crossed the quarantine line, 12 human vessels equipped with Vasquez drives disappeared from their positions in human space. They did not travel to the intrusion points. They did not confront the Council fleet. They went somewhere else entirely. The Defiance, now serving as the flagship of what was being called Task Force Ghost, jumped to a point approximately 200 light-years behind the Council fleet's lines of communication. It was followed by 11 other vessels, each carrying a specialized payload. What they did over the next 72 hours was not warfare. It was something that had no precedent in galactic history. The 12 vessels appeared one by one in systems that the Council had considered secure: rear areas, supply depots, communication hubs. In each system, they did not fire a weapon. They did not issue threats. They simply appeared, lingered long enough for their presence to be detected by local sensors, and then vanished. The message was implicit but unmistakable: we can be anywhere. We can reach anything. Your lines are meaningless. Your rear areas are not secure. Your homeworlds are not safe. The Council's response was immediate and dramatic. Every rear area fleet in Council space was placed on high alert. Defensive systems were activated across dozens of systems. Naval assets were pulled from the quarantine operation to protect interior territories. The carefully orchestrated Phase 2 deployment fell apart within hours, as commanders who had expected a conventional threat suddenly realized they were facing something they didn't understand. On the Veldrani homeworld, the Council convened an emergency session. The proceedings were not broadcast. The Council did not allow public access to its deliberations, but the outcome leaked within hours because everything leaked in galactic politics. The Council had voted to suspend Phase 2 and request immediate negotiations with humanity. The vote was not unanimous. It was 9-2 with the K-Threnti and the Fellini dissenting, but it was enough. The negotiations took place on a neutral station, a Veldrani-built orbital platform in a system that belonged to no one, designated as a diplomatic meeting ground by the Council centuries ago. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Thomas Reyes, Patricia Reyes' brother as it happened, a career diplomat who had been pulled out of semi-retirement specifically for this purpose. The Council delegation was led by the Veldrani ambassador, a being named Tailvren, who had held the post for over 200 years, and who was, by all accounts, deeply unhappy about the situation. The negotiations lasted for 11 days. The details were complex, involving legal language, territorial definitions, verification mechanisms, and the kind of procedural minutiae that made interstellar diplomacy such a soul-crushing profession. But the core of the agreement was simple. The quarantine would be lifted, immediately and unconditionally. Resolution 7749 Omega would be formally rescinded. Humanity's freedom of navigation would be reaffirmed, with additional provisions that prohibited the Council from imposing similar restrictions in the future without human participation in the voting process. Humanity would not share the Vasquez drive technology with the Council. This was non-negotiable, and the Council knew it. The demonstration of the drive's capabilities had made it clear that humanity possessed a strategic advantage that could not be countered by any known means, and the Council's demand for access to the technology had been met with a polite but firm refusal. In exchange, humanity agreed to establish a new diplomatic framework with the Council, a framework that gave humanity a more equal voice in Council deliberations, and that included, for the first time, a formal mechanism for resolving disputes that did not involve unilateral action by the Council against a member species. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. No shots had been fired, no territory had changed hands, no enemy had surrendered, but it was a victory nonetheless, the kind of victory that humanity seemed to specialize in, the kind that didn't look like a victory until you looked at it from the right angle. The Council had tried to contain humanity, and humanity had demonstrated that containment was impossible. Not through force of arms, but through ingenuity, determination, and a refusal to accept a position of subordination. Captain Sharma brought the Defiance home 3 days after the agreement was signed. The ship entered lunar orbit to a reception that was, by naval standards, extravagant. Every vessel in the Sol system had its running lights on, a gesture of respect that was usually reserved for returning heroes from major conflicts. Sharma stood on her bridge and watched the lights and felt nothing that she could easily name. She was not a hero. She had done a job, a difficult job, a risky job, but a job. The heroes, as far as she was concerned, were the people she couldn't see. Vasquez and her team, who had built a technology that shouldn't exist. Kowalski, who had made the hard calls. Park, the cargo pilot who had stolen a broken ship and flown it at the quarantine line because someone told her she couldn't. And the 900 passengers of the Star of Sol, who had sat in a civilian liner while a Veldrani warship matched course with them and hadn't broken. She thought about the Council's vote, 11-0. They had been so certain, so united, so confident in their authority that they hadn't even bothered to make the vote close, hadn't even offered humanity the courtesy of a contested decision. They had looked at humanity, a young species, a small species, a species that had been part of their community for only 2 centuries, and they had decided that humanity could be filed away, contained, managed. They had been wronged. Not because humanity was stronger. Humanity wasn't stronger, not then and arguably not now. The Council still outnumbered humanity in ships, in population, in resources, in everything that could be counted on a spreadsheet. But spreadsheets didn't capture the thing that had mattered most in this crisis. They didn't capture the thing that had driven Vasquez to build an impossible drive, and Park to steal a broken ship, and Sharma to jump her vessel 800 light-years into hostile territory on the strength of 11 test flights. They didn't capture the refusal. Every other species in the Council had at some point in their history accepted a limit. The Veldrani had accepted the limits of their biology. The Kathrenti had accepted the limits of their conservatism. The Sulemi had accepted the limits of their honesty. They had all found their equilibrium and settled into it, and from within that equilibrium humanity looked chaotic, dangerous, and fundamentally untrustworthy. But humanity had never accepted a limit, not willingly, not permanently. Every time someone told humans they couldn't do something, a certain percentage of them, sometimes small, sometimes large, but always present, would immediately set about proving that they could. It was not a cultural trait, it was not a political philosophy. It was something deeper, something baked into the species at a level that predated culture and politics entirely. It was the ancestral memory of a species that had survived ice ages and predators and diseases and each other, and that had done so by being too stubborn, too adaptable, and too relentlessly optimistic to die. The Council had declared war on that. Not a shooting war, a war of containment, a war of limits, a war that said stay in your place. And they had lost because you cannot contain a species that does not recognize the existence of containment. Sharma watched the lights of the fleet and thought about Jinsu Park sitting in a holding cell somewhere in Council space, and about the message that had rocketed across human space after her capture. Because they told me I couldn't. That was it, that was the whole story. Not the technology, not the strategy, not the diplomacy, all of that was secondary. The core of it was the refusal. The primal, irrational, magnificent refusal to accept a boundary drawn by someone else. The Defiance settled into its docking berth. The crew disembarked. Sharma was the last to leave, and as she walked down the gangway she passed a maintenance technician who was spray painting the ship's name on the hull. The technician looked up at her, grinned, and said, "Good name for her, Captain." Sharma looked back at the ship. TSV Defiance. 3 syllables that summed up the entirety of the human species' response to the Galactic Council's attempt to lock them away. "Yeah," she said, "it is." She walked into the station, and behind her the lights of the fleet burned on, and humanity went back to doing what humanity had always done, moving forward without permission, without apology, and without limit. The Galactic Council would never again vote unanimously on any matter involving humanity. The 11-0 decision that produced Resolution 7749 Omega would be cited for centuries as the most consequential mistake in the Council's 12,000-year history, not because of what it did, but because of what it revealed. It revealed that the Council's greatest strength, its unity, its consensus, its orderly process of collective decision-making, was also its greatest weakness. It revealed that a unanimous vote could be wrong. And it revealed that the species the Council had dismissed as young, chaotic, and dangerous was, in fact, all of those things, but that dangerous was not the same as wrong. In the years that followed, humanity's relationship with the Council evolved into something more balanced, more honest, and more productive than anything that had come before. The new diplomatic framework gave humanity a real voice, and humanity used that voice to challenge, to question, and to push, always to push, never to accept, never to settle. The Vasquez Drive remained a secret for another 30 years before its existence was officially confirmed. By that time, humanity had developed three successor technologies, each more advanced than the last, and the Council had long since stopped trying to keep up. Jinsu Park was awarded the Terran Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in human space. She used the ceremony to announce the formation of a new cargo company, which she named Can't as a deliberate provocation. The company became the largest freight operation in human space. Admiral Kowalski retired 2 years after the crisis. He was asked, in an interview shortly before his death, what he had felt when he first read the quarantine notification. He thought for a long time before answering. Relief, he said, the interviewer asked him to explain. For 200 years, Kowalski said, we'd been pretending we were just like them, pretending we could fit into their systems, play by their rules, be good members of their club. And the whole time we knew we couldn't, not because we weren't good enough, but because we weren't them. When they voted 11-0, they finally made it official. They told us we didn't belong, and that was the most honest thing they'd ever done. After that, we didn't have to pretend anymore. We could just be us. The interviewer asked what being us meant. Kowalski smiled. It means doing the thing that everyone says can't be done, and then doing the next thing and the next, until the people who said it couldn't be done stop talking. He died peacefully at the age of 91 in a house on a hill overlooking the ocean on Earth. The house was, by coincidence, 300 meters from the spot where the first Alcubierre Tanaka drive had been tested 250 years earlier. He had never stopped moving forward. None of them had.